Hello and welcome. Tonight, I invite you to sink into a gentle journey through time to the 12th century in a quiet English village. This is the story of Alys, a young girl whose life carries us through seasons of childhood, the first stirrings of womanhood, the customs of family, faith, and marriage. As you listen, let yourself drift deeper into the stillness of the past, where bells ring, candles flicker, and life moves at the pace of the turning seasons. And before we begin, tell me, from where in the world are you listening tonight? And at what time of day or night does this story find you? I would love to know where these medieval whispers travel and how far they reach. Please leave a write in the comments. Now, settle back, breathe slowly, and let us step together into the hush of the Middle Ages. The first sound of the day was not a bell, nor a voice, but the low hum of the earth itself. Long before the sun had lifted her pale face above the horizon, the village stirred. A cock crowed, thin and reedy against the heavy stillness of dawn. Somewhere in the darkness, a cow shifted her weight, hooves pressing into damp straw with a slow, muffled rhythm. Smoke, faint and blue, crept upward from one or two chimney holes in thatched roofs, curling lazily before the first light of morning wind scattered it across the thatch like a veil. The village lay close to a shallow river, its banks thick with reeds and willow. In summer the air was sweet with meadow flowers and hay. In winter, the water smelled sharp and metallic, as though stone itself had melted. This was England in the 12th century, a place where the forest pressed close and the fields never fully loosened their grip on the wild. The monastery lay to the north, no more than a mile away, its bell a constant presence, binding the village to a rhythm older and more exact than any sun or season. Our story begins here, in a hamlet of perhaps 20 cottages, each wall woven of wattle and daub, each roof of straw and rush, patched again and again against rain and wind. When you walked along the single packed dirt path that threaded between them, you could smell the mingling of lives: smoke, dung, damp wool, yeast rising in the dark, the faint iron tang of blood from a butchered pig cooling on a wooden slab. Children's voices carried softly, not yet in play, but in the obedient hush of work. The older boys tramped to the fields with their fathers, feet already wet with dew, hands clutching wooden handles worn smooth by use. The little ones stayed nearer home, carrying small bundles of kindling, filling clay jugs at the well, chasing the hens into corners. And among them, there was she, a girl of 12, neither child nor woman, though in the eyes of the village, her change was close enough to touch. Her name is not written in books, for such girls seldom found their way into parchment and ink. Yet she lived and breathed, and her heart carried its own music. Let us call her Alys, for many bore that name in her time. Alys lived in a cottage of one room, perhaps two, with walls pale and rough under the fire's glow. She slept on a pallet of straw, shared with her younger sister, with coarse woolen blankets that smelled faintly of sheep, and the lanolin that clung even after washing. When she woke that morning, her ears filled first with the sounds of her mother moving in the half-dark, the scrape of iron on wood, the soft cough that came with lifting damp logs, the whoosh as sparks caught and flared into flame. The light grew slowly. The single window, little more than an opening covered in oiled parchment, allowed in a dull gray glow, hazed and softened. As the fire crackled to life, the walls shifted from shadow to color: brown earth, pale rush mats, red clay pots resting in a row. Alys's breath rose in small puffs. The air was still cold, for spring had only begun to stir, and frost lingered in the thatch above. She rose without hurry, bare feet pressing against hard-packed earth that felt cool, almost damp. The rushes scattered across the floor crinkled under her steps, carrying with them their faint, sweet scent, mixed with something older, darker. The smell of smoke embedded in everything, the lingering must of the night. She pulled her kirtle over her head. Rough spun wool dyed a faded blue, patched at the hem, and stretched across her growing shoulders. Beneath it, she wore a shift of linen, soft from washing, yet always carrying the faint fragrance of lye and river water. Outside, the day called with simple tasks. The hens clucked impatiently in their pen, scratching straw with quick jerks of their claws. The sheep stirred beyond, their bleats low, muffled by mist. Alys stepped into the morning, and the world greeted her with scents more than sights. Wet grass, dung steaming faintly in the cold air, wood smoke drifting in pale threads above roofs. The soil was dark and heavy, pressed by countless bare feet and hooves. Yet spring flowers pushed through at the edges, primrose, with petals like drops of pale butter. This was the world of her childhood, though already she sensed it was shifting. She saw the girls older than herself, with their hair plaited differently, their bodies wrapped with greater care. They whispered together by the well, sometimes pausing when she approached, their voices lowering into secrets that were not for her ears. She knew only fragments, herbs, whispers of bleeding, the way the body changed. It was knowledge passed not in books, but in soft tones, behind closed doors, in gestures more than words. But for now, she was still bound to childhood tasks. With her sister beside her, she scattered grain for the hens, listening to the soft drumming of beaks on earth. She drew water from the well, the rope rough against her palms, the bucket heavy with cold liquid that splashed her toes when it swayed. She set it carefully inside, and the cottage filled with the gentle gurgle as her mother poured some into the pot, steam rising as oats met water. The fire snapped and hissed. The smell of porridge thickened the air, mingling with smoke and the faint tang of iron. Alys sat near the hearth, rubbing her hands together, her breath warming the tips of her fingers. Her father had already gone, his boots heavy on the path hours before. He would return with mud caked to his legs, the smell of horse and sweat clinging to him. For now, the house belonged to women and children, and their voices filled the small space with softness. The monastery bell rang out then, deep and measured, rolling over the fields like a voice older than any man. Its echo carried into the marrow of the day, marking the hour for prayer, for work, for the measured division of time. Alys closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound settle inside her. The monks beyond the fields prayed on her behalf, as they prayed for the whole world. Their chants bound heaven and earth together. And so the day unfolded, bread kneaded and left to rise beneath linen, wool teased and spun with slow fingers, hens gathered for eggs, warm beneath feathers, the children's laughter thin and sharp as birdsong. The world was simple, but never empty. It was full of textures, each moment stitched with sound and scent. The scrape of knife against board, the hiss of water on fire, the rough tickle of wool at the wrists, the faint sweet musk of herbs drying above the hearth. Alys felt these things deeply, though she did not always name them. She carried them in her skin, in her breath, in the quiet rhythm of her steps. And she carried something else too, something new, not yet spoken aloud, but pressing at the edges of her being. Her body was changing. Her mother had noticed. The way her face thinned, her limbs lengthened, her shoulders broadened beneath her kirtle. The way her sleep was heavier, her hunger sharper. Alys herself felt it in sudden heat across her cheeks, in small aches low in her belly, in restlessness that came like a tide and left her hollow. The village noticed too. They always did. In a place so small, nothing remained hidden long. The older women watched her with a kind of quiet knowledge, their eyes soft, their lips pressed together, as though they held words in check. The younger girls eyed her with a mixture of envy and curiosity, eager to see who would cross the threshold before them. Boys hardly looked at all. Not yet, not openly, but their laughter sometimes shifted when she passed. It was not yet her time, but it was close. And so the first chapter of her story lingers here, on the cusp of change, in a village where every sound mattered, where smoke hung in the air like a second skin, where the rhythm of the monastery bell shaped the hours, and where a girl named Alys stood at the doorway between childhood and something older, heavier, and secret. The day would continue, as days always did. But beneath it all, her body was preparing, weaving its own hidden rhythm, one that no bell could mark, no calendar could measure, a rhythm as old as womanhood itself, waiting for its first note. The fire was never allowed to die. Even in the deepest night, when sleep wrapped the village in silence, someone would rise to stir the embers, to lay on a scrap of wood, to breathe warmth into coals so they might survive until morning. For Alys's family, the hearth was more than a place of heat. It was the center of their lives, their light in darkness, their bread and comfort. The cottage smelled always of smoke, of wool, of damp wood, of bodies pressed close. Its walls were rough, patched again and again with clay and straw, darkened by years of soot rising in lazy curls. The low beams creaked in winter winds, and mice scurried in the thatch above, their tiny claws scratching like whispers. Yet to Alys, this house was safety. It was the sound of her mother humming while her hands worked, the sight of her father's broad shoulders bent by the doorway, the warmth of her sister's breath against her cheek as they lay side by side at night. Her family was small by village measure. Her father, her mother, 2 daughters, and a baby boy still at the breast. Many households held more: uncles, grandparents, cousins folded together in a single smoky room. But Alys's grandparents were gone, and her father's brother had joined the monks at the nearby priory. So the little cottage belonged mostly to them, and every sound was known, every absence felt. Her father, John, was a man shaped by soil and weather. His hands were wide and cracked, nails rimmed always with earth that no washing could fully remove. His hair was dark still, though streaked with gray at the temples, and his back bent from long days of plowing heavy clay. He did not speak much, and when he did, his words were plain as bread. Yet Alys watched the way people listened to him, neighbors, other men in the fields, and she knew he carried quiet weight. He feared God, feared hunger, feared the turning of seasons, but little else. Her mother, Mabille, was softer in voice, but not in will. Her hands moved endlessly, kneading dough, spinning wool, nursing the baby, weaving baskets, stirring pots. She seemed to live in constant rhythm, her body moving even when her mind drifted to song or prayer. Alys loved the smell of her mother's skin, warm and sweet with milk, mingled with the faint bitterness of smoke. She was not quick to laughter, but her eyes carried kindness, and her words, when they fell, were often wrapped in quiet care. Alys's sister, Edith, was only 9, still half a child, her hair tangled and her limbs thin. She followed Alys everywhere, carrying smaller bundles, fetching smaller buckets, mimicking her every move with a mixture of adoration and impatience. The baby, little Robert, was too young to know anything but warmth and hunger, though his presence filled the cottage with a different sound, soft and insistent. The whimper, the sudden cry, the long sigh as he drifted to sleep at his mother's breast. This was her family, plain, small, woven together, like the rushes on the floor. And in them, Alys found her place each day. That morning, as smoke thickened and the porridge bubbled, she sat beside Edith, both of them stirring with wooden spoons, as their mother sang low to the baby. The porridge was thick and gray, the smell plain, but hunger made it welcome. When it was ladled into wooden bowls, Alys cupped her hands around the warm vessel, feeling the heat seep into her palms. The texture was coarse, the taste heavy, but she chewed slowly, listening to the small sounds of her family. The suckling baby, Edith's impatient slurping, the scrape of spoon on wood, her mother's soft exhale as she settled by the fire. When her father returned at midday, his presence shifted the air. The doorway filled with his frame, light breaking behind him in a halo of pale sky. His boots were caked with mud, his shoulders damp from mist, his smell sharp with sweat and horse. He set down his tools with a thud that vibrated through the packed earth floor, and the children paused, eyes lifted. Alys always studied him in those first moments, the heaviness of his step, the tightness of his jaw. From these signs, she could read the day's temper, whether it carried quiet or storm. Today, he seemed weary, but not grim. He stooped to kiss the baby's head, his rough beard rasping against soft skin, and then sat heavily on the bench by the fire, his hands stretched toward the flames, palms open to warmth, steam rising faintly from his damp clothes. The room filled with the mingled scents of sweat and smoke, of porridge thickening on the pot, of damp wool steaming in heat. It was in such moments, crowded close, bodies pressed near the hearth, that Alys felt the shape of family most clearly. The world outside might be vast, the fields stretching, the forest looming, the monastery bell tolling over miles. But here, within these walls, everything narrowed to breath, to warmth, to the sound of wood popping in fire. She knew each sound of them, each movement, as though they were notes in a song only she could hear. At night, the cottage settled like a living thing. Her father stretched out near the hearth, Mabille with a baby curled at her breast, the girls huddled together on their straw bed. Darkness pressed close, pierced only by the faint glow of embers. Alys lay awake sometimes, listening. The deep, even breath of her father, the soft rustle of her mother shifting beneath blankets, the baby's small murmurs, Edith's foot twitching against her own, mice scurrying in the thatch, owls calling from the trees beyond. In these quiet hours, she often felt herself poised between two worlds. Childhood was not yet gone. She could still giggle with Edith over spilled milk, still race barefoot across the fields, still feel the thrill of chasing chickens into the pen. And yet, something else had begun. She sensed it in her body, in the way her hunger surged, her skin prickled with sudden heat, her moods deepened like pools. She sensed it in the way her mother sometimes looked at her with knowing eyes, lips pressed together, as if words hovered but did not fall. Her family would be the first to see her change. They would know before the village, before her friends. It was here, in this smoky cottage, that her secret rhythm would begin, quiet as breath, heavy as blood. But for now, the days passed in their simple measure, rising with the bell, working by the sun, sleeping in the hush of fire's glow. And within this rhythm, Alys's family moved together, bound by love unspoken, by hunger shared, by warmth exchanged. The cottage was small, and yet, to Alys, it was the whole world. Childhood in the 12th century was brief, more fragile than our own. Many babes never lived beyond their first winters. Fevers swept through villages with little warning, and hunger could thin a child's body until it bent like straw. Those who survived were soon pressed into work, their hands learning tasks before their limbs had grown strong enough for them. There was little space for long play, though laughter still echoed in fields and lanes. Alys had already passed through the tenderest years. At 12, she was counted lucky, her body strong, her limbs long, her eyes bright with health. She had carried water from the well since she was small, fetched wood from hedges, scattered grain for hens, weeded the barley with fingers still soft. Her hands bore faint calluses now. Her back ached at day's end. Yet these marks were not shame, but survival. Proof that she shared the rhythm of her people. Still, though she worked, the village knew she lingered at the edge of change. Childhood ended early, but womanhood began not with age alone. It came with signs the body whispered. The swelling of breast, the lengthening of limb, the deepening of breath, and at last the coming of the monthly blood. Only then was a girl seen as truly ripened, her body marked by nature as capable of bearing children, of feeding them, of continuing the fragile line of life. In medieval England, the age of this change was not fixed. Some girls, nourished well, bled as early as 11 or 12. Others, thinned by hunger or sickness, might wait until 15 or even later. Historians today read the bones of the past and note that in centuries of poor diet, menarche often came later than in our own time. Thin soups, coarse bread, and scarce meat slowed the body's growth. Yet still, the moment arrived, whether in plenty or want. And when it did, it was heavy with meaning. Alys felt it before it came. She noticed it first in the way her cradle pressed against her chest, the wool tight where once it had hung loose. The linen shift beneath chafed more at her skin, though its fibers had grown soft with use. When she bent to lift the water bucket, her back ached with new sharpness. Sometimes, in the fields, she felt warmth flood her cheeks without cause, a flush that left her breathless. At night, when she lay beside Edith, her dreams grew heavy, filled with strange heat, with images she could not name when she woke. The village marked her change in other ways. Neighbors called her to heavier work, to hold the sheep steady at shearing, to carry greater bundles of wood, to knead the bread as her mother did. The older women glanced at her in that lingering way, as though measuring the nearness of her first blood. Some even smiled softly, half in pity, half in pride, for they knew how narrow the path was, and how heavy the steps of womanhood could be. Her mother spoke little, though her eyes often lingered. Once, as Alys combed her tangled hair with wooden teeth, Mabille reached out, smoothing a lock between her fingers. "Soon," she whispered, and said no more. The word hung in the smoky air, heavy as the scent of herbs drying above the hearth. Among the girls her age, there was a quiet current of curiosity. The well whispers passed like folded cloth, carried from one to another. A cousin had begun to bleed at 11, and was now hidden away in work with the women, her laughter softer, her face often turned aside. Another girl, older, still had not, and the younger ones teased her, though their eyes showed fear, for late blooming was seen with unease, as though her body lingered too long between worlds. Alys listened, but said little. Inside her, she felt something stirring, low aches in her belly, heaviness in her breasts, a strange tiredness at dawn. She did not speak of it to Edith, who still tumbled like a child in the hay, unknowing, nor to her father, whose world seemed made of fields and beasts, not of secret rhythms hidden in women's bodies. It was her mother, perhaps, who waited for her to ask, but Alys's lips stayed closed. In truth, silence was part of the custom. Menstruation was known, but rarely spoken of in open air. The church taught that women's bleeding marked the legacy of Eve, a sign of weakness, of impurity. Yet in cottages, among wives and midwives, there was knowledge far older: how to wash cloth in cold water, how to fold wool to catch the flow, which herbs eased cramping, which prayers soothed shame. Girls learned this not through books or priests, but through quiet hands guiding theirs, through whispers by the fire, through the smell of drying rags and the touch of mother's smoothing hair. And so Alys waited, her body swelling with signals she barely understood, her mind restless with questions. Each dawn she rose to the bell, to the smoke, to the weight of work. Each dusk she lay beneath the crackling rafters, listening to the night. And beneath it all, in silence, the rhythm of her blood prepared its first arrival, hidden as roots beneath soil, patient as the moon in its turning. The world of women in Alys's village was both open and hidden. Open in that their bodies were always visible, bent to the well, stooped in fields, kneeling by hearths. Yet hidden in that their deeper knowledge about birth, bleeding, herbs, and the secrets of flesh was spoken softly, shared only from woman to woman, away from men's ears and the judgment of priests. Alys had long been aware of this shadowed world. She had seen the way her mother and the other wives leaned close together when they spoke, their heads bent so hair touched hair, their hands busy even as their voices dropped. She had watched the midwife, Goody Agnes, shuffle through the village with her bundle of herbs tied in cloth, her eyes keen as a bird's, her voice roughened by age. The men greeted her curtly, almost warily, for she carried knowledge that unsettled them, the mysteries of women's bodies, which the church itself sometimes viewed with suspicion. Agnes smelled always of sage and smoke, her fingers stained with the green of crushed leaves. She knew which herbs eased bleeding, which soothed fevers, which chased worms from children's bellies. Some whispered that she muttered charms as well as prayers, though she herself would always claim her words were only to the Virgin. Alys was both frightened and drawn to her, for Agnes carried the weight of secrets that Alys yearned to understand. It was said among the women that when a girl's first blood came, Agnes was often called. Not to heal, there was no sickness in it, but to guide, to remind, to place herbs in the girl's hand and tell her what to do. "Keep clean," she would murmur. "Boil water for your cloths. Rest when the ache comes. Drink pennyroyal if the flow grows heavy. And above all, tell no man." Alys had not yet bled, but she had begun to hear fragments of such counsel. Once, as she fetched water from the well, she overheard two older girls whispering of cloths hidden in rush baskets, of bloodstains that must be scrubbed before mothers found them. They spoke of shame, but also of pride, as though the blood marked a threshold, a doorway to womanhood. Their voices carried a mixture of fear and boasting, and Alys felt a strange stirring in her chest, a pull between curiosity and dread. Her mother, too, began to leave small hints. She set aside pieces of worn linen, folding them neatly, placing them high on the shelf. She dried certain herbs by the fire: yarrow, mugwort, chamomile, plants Alys knew were used for women's ailments. Once, as Alys helped grind oats, Mabil said softly, "You'll need cloth of your own soon." Her tone was calm, not unkind, but final, as though she announced a season's turning. History tells us that in villages like Alys's, menstruation was both natural and taboo. The church, following ancient writings, taught that a bleeding woman was ritually impure, unfit to touch holy objects or enter the sanctuary. Some priests even warned that her touch could sour wine or wither crops. Yet among women themselves, the blood was less a curse than a burden, an inconvenience, a mess to manage, a rhythm to endure. It was not celebrated, but neither was it wholly despised. It was simply life, carried forward in cycles as steady as the moon. Materially, women managed with what they had. There were no fine cloths for peasants, no soft wools reserved for such use. Instead, they folded scraps of old linen, coarse and rough, washing them in cold water by the river, drying them by the fire, hiding them among other laundry so as not to draw eyes. Some, when poor or caught unprepared, stuffed wool or moss between their thighs, changing it often to avoid chafing. The smell of blood, mixed with smoke and earth, a scent Alys would soon know well. When women bled, they often withdrew slightly from men's company. Not always outwardly, work could not stop, but inwardly, they moved among themselves. Alys had seen her mother and the others gather at the well, speaking in low tones, their eyes flicking toward the girls who lingered nearby. Knowledge passed in gestures, the way a cloth was folded, the way a hand pressed briefly to a belly, the way an older girl touched her friend's arm in sympathy. In such ways, the knowledge was never written, yet it endured. Medieval medical texts, written by monks in Latin, spoke of women's courses as if they were sickness, a purging of black humors. But in the cottages, women knew better. It was not sickness, but rhythm. Painful, tiring, sometimes heavy, but not unnatural. Their wisdom was practical, shaped by daily life, not parchment. Alys felt herself leaning toward this hidden world. When her chores brought her near the older girls, she listened. When her mother muttered over herbs, she watched. Even the smell of sage or yarrow stirred her heart, as though those leaves carried whispers only women could hear. She began to sense that her body was no longer hers alone, but part of a web of women, stretching backward through mothers and grandmothers, forward into daughters, not yet born. One evening, as the fire burned low and the cottage lay hushed, Mabille sat beside Alys, the baby asleep against her breast. She reached into a basket and drew out a folded square of linen, worn but clean. She placed it in Alys's lap. "Keep this near you," she said softly. Alys's fingers traced the rough weave, the edges frayed by years of washing. The cloth smelled faintly of smoke, of river water, of sun. She looked up at her mother, questions rising to her lips, but Mabille only shook her head, her eyes steady. "You'll know when," she murmured. The cloth lay heavy in Alys's lap, though it weighed almost nothing. She felt the warmth of the fire, the coolness of night air pressing at the door, the softness of her sister's breathing beside her. In that moment, she knew she stood on the threshold of knowledge, not yet through, but close enough to feel its breath against her skin. The women's world waited for her. The first signs came quietly, like footsteps on soft earth. They did not arrive with a shout, but with a whisper in Alys's flesh, a rhythm her body began to play, though she had no words for its music. It was early spring when she noticed the heaviness in her belly. She was bent at the well, pulling the rope hand over hand, when a dull ache bloomed low inside her. It was not sharp, not sickness, but a weight, a pulling downward. She paused, her breath catching, one hand pressed to her middle. Around her, the village went on, children's voices, hens scratching, the far-off call of a crow. Yet for her, the moment lingered, strange and private. By the time she carried the bucket home, the ache had eased, fading into the ordinary tiredness of work. But it returned days later, and again after that, always low and quiet, like a drumbeat beneath her skin. She said nothing, not at first. Words felt too heavy, too revealing. Instead, she watched her own body more closely. In the stillness of night, when Edith slept beside her, Alys touched her breastbone and felt how her chest had grown tender, the curve fuller than before. She traced the outline of her body beneath the wool blanket and wondered at the changes, the stretching of her limbs, the faint down along her arms, the way her hips pressed wider into the straw beneath her. History tells us that in Alys's time, people explained such changes through the theory of humors. The body, it was said, was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health came from balance, sickness from excess. A girl's monthly bleeding was described as the natural purging of surplus blood, a cleansing of the body. Learned men in monasteries wrote that when a girl reached her 12th or 13th year, her body grew full of warm, moist blood, which had to be released. They saw it as proof of nature's wisdom, though also as a sign of female weakness. But Alys did not know these Latin words, or the diagrams monks drew in their manuscripts. She knew only what her flesh told her. The warmth that rose in her cheeks without cause, the sudden dampness under her arms as she worked, the restless thrumming of her heart at odd moments. She felt herself caught between fatigue and strange bursts of energy, laughing one moment, near tears the next. Edith teased her for sulking, and Alys snapped in return, only to feel shame flood her afterward. The women of the village would not have been surprised. They had seen these signs before. The quick moods, the flush of skin, the clumsy ache in limbs too swiftly grown. They knew that before the blood came, the body signaled its nearness. They had words for it, though always whispered. Her courses, her flowers, her moon. Some spoke of it in fear, others with resignation, a few with quiet pride. But all recognized the signs when they appeared. One afternoon, as Alys helped her mother spin wool, she grew dizzy. The spindle whirled in her fingers, the thread twisting fine, when suddenly her vision blurred, her breath shallow. She dropped the spindle and pressed her hand to her head. The room swayed with heat, the air thick with the smell of lanolin and smoke. Mobile's eyes flicked to her quickly, sharp and knowing. "Enough," she said, taking the wool from Alys's hands. "Go sit by the fire." Alys obeyed, cheeks burning, shame prickling her skin. She sat with her knees drawn up, staring into the flames. The fire hissed as sap popped in the wood. The warmth pressed against her face until sweat dampened her brow. Her mother did not speak further, but later, as they spread rushes across the floor for the night, she placed a hand on Alys's shoulder. "The signs are coming," she said softly. Her voice was neither stern nor tender, only matter-of-fact, like the turning of a season. Alys nodded, though her throat felt tight. That night, she dreamed of water. She stood at the river's edge, the moon silvering the surface, the current swirling red around her ankles. She reached down to touch it, and the water felt warm as blood. She woke with her heart pounding, her shift clinging damp to her skin. The sound of her sister's soft breathing steadied her, but the dream lingered, heavy and unsettling. In the days that followed, her senses sharpened. She smelled the sour tang of dung more strongly, the sweetness of baking bread more deeply. The crackle of fire seemed louder, the cry of the baby more piercing, the brush of wool against her wrists more irritating. It was as if her body had become a vessel too full, every drop of sensation spilling over. Medieval records note that many girls feared their first bleeding, for it came without warning and was often interpreted as illness. Some thought themselves wounded, cursed, or struck by divine punishment. Yet others, prepared by mothers or midwives, met it with less fear, though still with unease. For peasants like Alys, whose lives were filled with work and hunger, there was little room for wonder. The blood was another burden, to be endured like aching backs or frostbitten fingers. Still, within the silence, there was a thread of awe. To bleed without wound, to flow with the moon, to carry within one's body the rhythm of fertility. These were mysteries as old as Eve, spoken of in hushed tones, feared by men, yet understood by women. Alys did not yet bleed, but she felt the nearness of it in every shift of her body. She sensed it in her mother's watchful gaze, in the whispers of girls at the well, in the faint heaviness that settled low in her belly with each passing week. She was not a child any longer, though she could still run through fields with Edith, still laugh at the geese splashing in the shallows. Yet she was not yet a woman either. She stood at the narrow threshold, her body humming with a rhythm only she could hear, waiting for the moment when silence would break into flow. And though she did not know it, that moment was close. The morning it came was not unlike any other. The cock crowed while the horizon was still bruised with the last of night, and Alys stirred on her straw mattress. Beside her, Edith mumbled in her sleep and pulled the wool blanket tighter. The air was damp and chill, the faintest drizzle pattering against the thatch above. Alys rose quietly, her shift clinging to her skin with the cold, and stepped onto the rush-strewn floor. The reeds cracked faintly under her toes. She bent to tie her shoes and felt it then. A sudden wetness, warm and unexpected, low between her thighs. She froze, half bent, her breath caught. Slowly, with trembling fingers, she touched the fabric of her shift. It was damp, unmistakably so. She drew her hand back into the pale light seeping through the shutters. Her fingertips were stained red. Alys stared at the color, her heart thundering. For a moment, fear clenched her chest. Had she cut herself? Was she wounded without knowing? But no pain came, only that strange warmth, the trickling sense of release. She sat back on the mattress, breathing quickly. The straw rustled, and Edith stirred, blinking sleep from her eyes. "What is it?" her sister whispered, voice rough with dreams. Alys hesitated, then shook her head. "Nothing," she murmured, though her voice cracked. When Edith's breathing slowed again, Alys pressed the hem of her shift between her legs, trying to staunch the flow. But the blood kept coming, seeping through the linen. She felt it sticky against her thighs, foreign, and yet not wholly frightening. A part of her remembered her mother's quiet words, the warnings whispered in the spinning room. The signs are coming. And now they had arrived. By the time Abil noticed, the day was half awake. Smoke curled from the hearth, and the smell of oats thickened the room. She saw Alys sitting apart, pale-faced, hands pressed tightly in her lap. Without a word, Abil set down her spoon and crossed the room. She crouched beside her daughter, her eyes steady and searching. "It has begun," she said softly. Alys's throat closed. She managed a nod. Her mother's hands, calloused from years of grinding grain and kneading bread, touched her shoulders gently. There was no surprise in her face, only calm recognition, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. In medieval England, such a moment was not merely personal. It was woven with cultural meaning. Learned men wrote that the first bleeding marked the shift from girlhood to womanhood, though often with unease. The church fathers warned that menstruating women were impure, unfit to touch holy relics or step near the altar. Parish priests sometimes repeated these words, though village life softened them. Necessity demanded that women cook, tend, and work regardless of their bleeding. Among peasant women, the moment was understood more practically. They had no silken cloths or perfumed waters, as wealthy ladies did. Instead, they used scraps of linen, often cut from worn-out undergarments, folded and tucked into place. Some stuffed soft moss or wool into their shifts, changing it when it grew too wet. The cloths were washed in cold water, discreetly, and hung by the hearth to dry, where no man would question them. Abil, too, had prepared. From a chest by the wall, she drew a folded strip of old linen, its edges frayed. She handed it to Alys, without ceremony. "Keep it close," she murmured. "Rinse it well, but do not let the men see." Alys's cheeks flushed. She clutched the cloth, feeling its rough weave against her skin. It smelled faintly of smoke and lavender, stored with the family's few precious herbs to ward off moths. The rest of that day unfolded in a haze. The bleeding came and went, at times stronger, at times fading. Alys moved carefully, each step reminding her of the dampness between her legs, the awkward bulk of the cloth tucked inside her shift. She kept her eyes low, fearful that others might somehow see what she carried within her. At the well, she overheard women whispering. One spoke of her own first time, how she thought herself dying, until her aunt laughed and called her foolish. Another warned of dangers, that if a girl bathed in cold water during her bleeding, she might never bear children. A third claimed the blood could sour milk or spoil meat if she touched it. Their voices were hushed, but their words carried centuries of lore. Medieval medicine echoed such fears. Physicians wrote that menstrual blood was poisonous, capable of withering crops, rusting iron, and driving dogs mad. These writings, copied in monasteries, rarely touched the lives of peasant women directly, but echoes of them filtered down through superstition and rumor. And yet, amidst the fear, there was also recognition that this blood, dangerous though it was said to be, was also the source of life itself. Without it, no child could quicken in the womb. Alys felt none of this grandeur. She felt only the tugging cramps in her belly, the weakness in her knees, the strange quiet that seemed to settle over her senses. The world smelled sharper, the smoke thicker, the wool harsher. She longed to lie down, but there was always work, feeding hens, turning earth, stirring the pot. By evening, as the hearth light warmed the room, Mabille sat beside her again. She dipped the cloth into a bowl of chamomile water and pressed it into Alys's hand. "Hold this to your belly," she said. "It eases the ache." The warmth soothed her, the bitter-sweet scent of chamomile rising with the steam. Alys closed her eyes, letting the sounds of the room wash over her, the crackle of the fire, the murmur of her father's voice, the shuffle of Edith arranging the rushes. The pain softened, and with it came a strange peace. In that peace, Alys began to understand what had happened. She was no longer merely a child, free to run wild and unnoticed. She had entered the circle of women, bound by the same rhythms her mother and grandmother had known. She would share their burdens, their whispers, their quiet resilience. And though the church might call her impure, though men might shun the blood as dangerous, within her there stirred a sense of hidden power. She carried a mystery that no sermon could erase, a rhythm older than parchment or prayer. When she lay down that night, the linen tucked beneath her, she listened to the rain on the roof, steady and soft, like the beat of her own body. She felt the weight of the cloth, the damp warmth, the ache still lingering low, and she breathed deeply, letting herself drift into sleep, knowing she had crossed a threshold that would never be uncrossed. The moment had come, and with it, the long unfolding of womanhood. The weeks after that first bleeding passed quietly, yet within Alys, the world felt altered. She noticed time differently now, marked not only by the turning of the moon or the feast days of saints, but by the slow rhythm of her own body. Each month, when her belly grew heavy and the faint ache began to coil low within her, she knew what was coming. No longer did she fear the sudden warmth between her thighs. She expected it, prepared for it, and slowly, though clumsily, learned to live with it. Mabille, her mother, had been her first guide. From the wooden chest at the corner of their cottage, she showed Alys the store of old linen rags cut from worn shirts and shifts. Some were patched, others frayed, but all were clean. Together, they boiled them in a pot with rosemary and sage, herbs said to drive away foul humors and lessen the stench, and then dried them before the hearth. The cloths were soft and faintly perfumed, tucked away in a small bag that only the women of the house touched. "You must wash them yourself," Mabille warned, her tone calm but firm. "Do not let your brothers see, nor your father. These are women's matters, and they will not understand." So Alys did. At the stream, she bent low, scrubbing the cloths in the cold current. She watched the water swirl red, then fade, carrying the secret away downstream. She rinsed until the fabric paled again, wrung them tight, and tucked them beneath her apron to dry later by the fire. It was quiet work, private, and in that privacy she felt both shame and belonging. In medieval villages, such routines were universal. Women managed their monthly cycles with linen pads, moss, or even bundles of sheep's wool, depending on what they could spare. Wealthy women, enclosed in manors, sometimes stitched fine absorbent cloths or imported cotton, while peasant women like Alys made do with what was at hand. All were reused, washed, and dried in hidden corners. To waste cloth was unthinkable. Fabric was labor, time, and coin. Medicinal remedies filled the gap where comfort was scarce. Chamomile, boiled in water, eased cramps. Mugwort was tucked into belts or brewed as tea, believed to steady the flow. Rue and yarrow were whispered of, too, though some herbs carried danger if taken in excess, for they could bring not only relief, but miscarriage. Knowledge of such herbs passed quietly between women, mothers to daughters, midwives to maidens, seldom written in books, but carried in memory, in the low hum of female voices around the hearth. Mabille shared what she knew, and Alys listened closely. She learned which herbs to gather in summer for drying, which roots to store against the frost. She bound sprigs of mugwort with twine and tucked them in the rafters. She kept a pouch of dried chamomile blossoms by her bed, their scent soothing even when she did not drink them. The cycle itself brought more than physical change. When the blood came, Alys often withdrew. The ache in her belly made her slower at her tasks. She found herself clumsy with the distaff, weary at the churn, quick to tears at Edith's teasing. At first she scolded herself, thinking she was weak. But Mabille only shook her head with knowing eyes. "It is the way of it," her mother said. "Your strength bends and flows as the moon does. Some days you will feel heavy, others quick as fire. Pay heed, and you will learn when to rest, when to labor." And so Alys watched herself as she watched the sky. She noticed how, in the days before her bleeding, her temper sharpened, her patience thinned. She noticed, too, how after the flow had passed, she felt lighter, as though cleansed. These patterns became her own quiet calendar, as important as the saints' days carved into the parish book. Not all spoke of it kindly. In church, the priest repeated old words from the fathers of the faith, that a woman in her bleeding days was unclean, that she must not touch holy things, that her presence near the altar was dangerous. Some whispered that women should not receive the host during their courses, though in many villages this rule was not kept. Life was too hard to deny grace for a week each month. Still, the weight of such teachings pressed on Alys's mind. On Sundays, if her bleeding had begun, she lingered at the edge of the nave, her eyes lowered. She dared not cross herself too boldly. When the bell rang and the host was lifted, she bowed her head, uncertain whether she was welcome beneath the gaze of heaven. Yet outside the church, among the women at the well, or the spinning frame, talk was more forgiving. "It is our lot," an old widow told her once, her back bent, her hands busy with a bundle of rushes. "God made it so. No child is born without the blood. If priests call it unclean, they forget it is the root of life." Such words settled in Alys's heart more deeply than any sermon. Seasons turned, and with them her cycles grew steadier. In spring, when lambs bleated in the meadows and the fields were plowed, her bleeding came light and brief, leaving her free to walk among the blossoms. In summer, the heat made it heavy, and she sometimes staggered with weakness while gathering berries or binding sheaves. In autumn, the cramps sharpened, sending her to bed with a hot stone pressed to her belly. And in winter, when the cold stiffened her limbs, she bled more slowly, as though the frost itself slowed her body's tide. She began to see herself as part of this greater rhythm. The earth gave and withdrew. So did she. The moon swelled and waned. So did she. Life, in all its forms, pulsed with the same hidden beat. Over time, she learned to hide her cloths more cleverly, to carry herself without betraying the awkward bulge beneath her shift. She learned to breathe through the pain when no rest was possible, to hum quietly as she churned butter, steadying herself with rhythm. She learned to smile, even when pale, to keep her secrets safe from the eyes of men who would not understand. And with each month, her place among the women of the village deepened. They saw in her the sign of ripening, the unspoken truth that soon she would be sought as a bride. She felt their glances, their measured words, and knew that her bleeding marked not only her body, but her destiny. Yet for now, she remained in her mother's care, learning the lore of herbs, the patience of cloth, the resilience of silence. And beneath it all, she carried a growing sense of quiet strength. For though the world called her unclean, she knew in her bones that this hidden rhythm was sacred, a thread binding her not only to her mother and sister, but to every woman who had ever bled beneath the same stars. That winter, as snow lay heavy on the thatch and the hearth burned low, Alys sat spinning by the fire. The ache in her belly pulsed gently, but she spun steadily, the wool slipping through her fingers. Outside, the moon rose, round and pale. She paused, watching its light spill through the shutters, silver against the rushes. She smiled faintly, understanding now what she had not before, that her body and the moon moved as one, ancient and unbroken. And she whispered to herself, so softly that none but the fire could hear, "This is my way. This is my time." The year after Alys first bled, something subtle but undeniable changed in the air around her. It was not her body alone that carried signs of newness, though her face had softened, her figure grown taller, her hair glossier in the candlelight. It was the way people looked at her, the way their voices shifted when her name was spoken. She was no longer merely the youngest daughter of Mabille and Thomas the Thatcher. She was a maiden now, and with maidenhood came expectations that stretched far beyond her mother's hearth. The first whispers it began with glances at the market. When Alys walked beside Edith to sell eggs or to fetch salt from the peddler's stall, she felt eyes upon her, men's eyes, measuring, curious. Some were harmless, quick flickers of notice. Others lingered too long, making her cheeks burn. Edith teased her once, nudging her elbow and whispering, "They look because they see you are near ready for a husband." Alys had no answer. She dropped her gaze to her basket, the eggs trembling with each hurried step. At the well, too, she noticed changes. The older women no longer spoke around her as though she were a child. Instead, they wove hints into their words, measuring her reaction. "Thomas's girl grows tall," one remarked, half smiling. "Aye, she has her mother's eyes," another said, "and soon she will have a man's house to tend." The words clung to her like burrs. She carried them home, uncertain whether to feel pride or dread. Marriage in the medieval village. For girls like Alys, marriage was less a choice than a stage in life, expected as surely as winter followed autumn. In the England of the late 14th century, peasant girls often married in their mid to late teens. Some wed earlier, especially in noble families where alliances mattered. But in villages, the age was tempered by necessity. A girl had to be strong enough to bear children, skilled enough in household tasks to manage a home, and her family needed the means to provide a dowry, goods, coins, or livestock offered to her husband to secure the match. Marriage was not simply about affection. It was an exchange of labor, property, and survival. Two families joined their fortunes. Two households balanced their needs. Alys knew this. for she had seen neighbors' daughters wed. She had watched brides walk to church in woolen gowns, garlands of flowers in their hair, their dowries carried behind them in baskets. She had heard the bells ring as vows were spoken, the priests' Latin falling over their bowed heads. She had also seen the burdens that followed. Young wives rose before dawn to bake bread, tend animals, and soothe infants. Their laughter was rare, their shoulders stooped with work before 20 summers had passed. The priest's counselate was Father Oswald, the parish priest, who first spoke directly to Alice's parents. One Sunday after Mass, as folk gathered in the churchyard to share news, he drew Thomas aside. His voice was low, but Alice caught enough to make her stomach twist. "Your daughter is of age now. Suitors will come. Better to guide her path than let gossip shape it." Thomas nodded stiffly, his eyes dark. Mabille, standing nearby, placed a hand upon Alice's shoulder, gentle but firm, as though to anchor her against a tide she could not resist. That night, at the hearth, her parents spoke in hushed tones. Alice sat spinning, the whir of the wheel masking little. She heard the word dowry, heard mention of hens, a cow, perhaps even the chest her grandmother had carved. Each word felt like a step toward a door that was opening, a door she was not yet ready to pass through. Between childhood and bridehood, and yet, despite the whispers, she remained caught between two worlds. In the fields, she still laughed with Edith, chasing geese and skipping over furrows. At night, she still curled beside her younger brothers, telling them tales of knights and dragons. A part of her clung fiercely to that childhood freedom. But when the moon cycle came and she bled again, she felt the weight of womanhood return. Each flow reminded her she was no longer a child. Her body was ready for what others expected, whether her heart was or not. Mabille noticed the tension. One evening, while mending shirts by the fire, she said softly, "Do not fear, Alice. A woman is not lost when she marries. She carries her mother within her, her own self too. It is a change, aye, but not an end." Alice nodded, but the comfort was thin. She wondered if her mother truly believed it, or if it was only a kindness spoken to soften the truth. Courtship in the village. The first suitor appeared not long after. He was a miller's son, broad-shouldered, with hands rough from turning the grindstone. His family was modest but steady, their trade secure. He brought a gift of honeycomb when he came to speak with Thomas, his smile quick and eager. Alice watched from the corner, her heart fluttering strangely. He was not unkind to look at, but he was older by several years, his manner too confident, his voice too loud. She felt like a child before him, though he spoke to her as though she were already a wife. When he left, Mabille asked gently, "And what think you of him?" Alice only shook her head, her throat too tight for words. The matter faded, for Thomas did not press it. But Alice knew others would come. The weight of reputation. In those days, a maiden's reputation was as fragile as glass. A careless word, a walk alone with the wrong man, could shatter her chances of a good match. Mothers warned their daughters to keep their eyes low, their voices modest, their laughter soft. A girl who seemed too bold, too knowing, was whispered about, and whispers spread quickly in villages where every life was visible. Alice felt that scrutiny keenly. She walked more carefully, spoke more gently, carried herself with a dignity she did not yet feel, but knew was expected. It was like wearing a garment too large, one she would grow into, whether she wished or not. Womanhood, as identity, her monthly bleeding, once a private rhythm, became the silent marker that everyone seemed to know without being told. It was not spoken of openly, yet it hung in the air. Women glanced at her with recognition. Men glanced at her with new interest. Even children sensed the difference, for her brothers teased her less, as though some invisible line had been crossed. She belonged now to that hidden sisterhood of women who bore the weight of life itself. The blood was no longer just hers. It was proof to all around her that she was capable of becoming wife and mother. And so her identity shifted. She was still Alys, daughter of Thomas, and Mabille, sister of Edith. But she was also something more, a maiden at the threshold of womanhood, with all the expectation and uncertainty that entailed. A moment of stillness. One night, unable to sleep, Alys slipped outside. The village was quiet, the cottages dark, save for the faint glow of embers. She walked to the edge of the fields, where the barley had been harvested, and the stubble gleamed silver under the moon. She stood there long, her breath white in the air. The moon was nearly full, its light spilling like milk over the land. She pressed a hand to her belly, knowing her cycle would soon return. In that stillness, she felt the weight of both past and future. She thought of her mother, who had once stood as she did now. She thought of the generations of women before, each marked by the same rhythm, each folded into the same pattern of maiden, wife, mother, widow. And she whispered to the night, half in prayer, half in defiance, "Let me not be lost in it. Let me still be Alys." Thus, month by month, season by season, she moved deeper into her new identity. Childhood slipped behind her like a garment laid aside, and the world pressed her steadily toward the path of womanhood. She did not know yet which man's hearth she would tend, nor whose children she would bear. But she knew that the rhythm of her body had bound her to that fate, as surely as the tides were bound to the moon. And though fear lingered, so too did a quiet strength, the sense that, whatever lay ahead, she carried within her the enduring pulse of all women before her. The weeks after Alys's first bleeding seemed to move differently, as if the sun itself turned with slower gravity. She still rose at dawn, still carried water, spun wool, fed hens, and swept the dirt floor. But something invisible had shifted. Her mother watched her with quiet calculation. Her father, though not unkind, carried a new firmness in his voice when speaking of her future. It began with the chest. Her father brought it in from the shed one damp morning, a rough box of oak with iron bands, its wood smelling of age and smoke. It was not fine, the carvings were simple, the hinges stiff, but it was sturdy. Alys knew what it meant before he even spoke. "Best we see it filled, little by little," Richard said, running his hand along the lid, "so she will not go empty when the time comes." A dowry chest, Alys's dowry chest. Her stomach tightened, though she tried not to show it. Edith peered over her shoulder, wide-eyed with curiosity, but Alys kept her gaze lowered. That day, her mother placed into it the first piece, a linen shift, hand-sewn from cloth Mabille had spun and bleached herself. The fabric was coarse, but the seams neat, the hem steady. Alys touched it with reverence, feeling the grain of the weave against her fingertips. "This is the start," Mabille said simply. From then on, each week, something new was added. A wooden spoon, carved by her uncle. A small strip of embroidered cloth, stitched in evenings by firelight. A length of woolen yarn, dyed pale green with nettles and ash. These were not luxuries, but tokens of her family's labor, the promise of usefulness she would bring into another household. Historically, dowries in England's villages were modest compared to the great estates of nobles, but they mattered deeply. For peasants, they might be no more than clothing, a few tools, some livestock, if fortune allowed. Yet even so, they were symbols of honor and survival, proof that a girl came not empty-handed, but as a partner in building life anew. In the 12th century, many such arrangements were oral, made between families before witnesses. Yet the church courts, increasingly powerful, began to insist on rules. Marriage was not simply property exchange, but a sacrament, a bond of consent. Still, In Alys's world, practical concerns pressed harder than theology. One evening, as they ate pottage by firelight, Richard spoke of neighbors' daughters. Emma, from the mill, wed at 14, though she is not so strong as our Alys. Her dowry was a single cow, yet her father made much of it. Mabille sniffed. And Emma has been near worn to death with 2 babes already. Let that not be Alys's fate. Richard nodded, chewing slowly. Still, we must think. She will not wait forever. Alys kept her head bent over her bowl, the steam rising into her face. Their words flowed over her like rain on a thatched roof. Steady, inevitable, impossible to stop. She did not yet know who her husband might be. That decision lay with her parents, though the church whispered of consent. In theory, Alys had to agree, for no priest could bless a union against the bride's will. Yet consent was a fragile thing in a world where a girl's survival rested in her family's bargains. Pressure could make a word of assent as heavy as stone. The next week, Alys's mother took her to visit a neighbor, a widow named Agnes, who was known for her knowledge of herbs and women's matters. Agnes's cottage smelled of dried sage and rushes, the air warm with the sweetness of stored apples. She looked Alys over with a sharp, assessing gaze. "She is tall enough," Agnes said, tilting Alys's chin with her finger. "Broad in the hips. She will bear children well enough." Alys flushed, the words burning her ears. "Has the blood come?" Agnes asked Mabille. Mabille nodded once. "Then the counting begins." Agnes's tone was calm, factual, like noting the phases of the moon. "Her months will tell her strength. Watch her color, her appetite. If she weakens, give her nettle broth. If she falters, warm wine with rosemary. But she looks healthy. She will manage." The women spoke of herbs and cycles, of bedding and birth, as if Alys were not in the room. She sat quietly, hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the flickering fire. Yet every word sank into her, like drops of dye seeping through cloth. Back at home, the chest grew heavier. A second shift was folded neatly inside, then a belt of plain leather, then a small set of pewter spoons, costly, for her father had bartered grain to obtain them. Edith peered into the chest often, running her fingers over its treasures. To her younger sister, it seemed like magic, the slow building of a new world. To Alys, it felt like a narrowing, a funnel through which her life was being guided. Historically, church courts held sway in these matters. By the mid-12th century, canon law declared that marriage was formed not by parental contract alone, but by the free consent of the couple. Yet in practice, especially among peasants, the will of families weighed more than the theories of Rome. The courts were busy with disputes, men denying unions, women claiming promises of betrothal, parents contesting dowries. Priests were called to witness, to bless, to judge, their words binding not only on earth, but in heaven. In the village, such authority felt both distant and near. The priest in the parish church preached of holy matrimony as a sacrament. Yet in daily life, people spoke of cattle, fields, and alliances. Alys would belong not just to a man, but to his kin, his labor, his soil. One night, as the wind rattled the shutters, Alys lay awake, listening to her parents whisper. "Thomas, the thatcher, has made an inquiry," her father said, his voice low but clear. Mabille replied, sharp. "He is too old, nearly 30, his beard more gray than black. He has land enough and steady work. Land matters little if she is beaten or left widowed. I will not see her wasted." The voices faded, but Alys's heart thudded in the dark. Her name, her fate, passed between them, like a token in trade. She clutched her blanket tighter, staring at the rafters, the shadows shifting with firelight. The dowry chest sat at the foot of her bed, its iron bands gleaming faintly. She could almost hear it breathe, as if each item inside gave it more life, more weight, more inevitability. By day, she stitched with her mother, spinning wool into thread, weaving strength into cloth that might one day swaddle her own children. By night, she dreamed of rivers, of doors closing and opening, of voices she could not answer. For Alys, the season of waiting had begun. The wind carried with it the scent of damp earth and fading leaves. Autumn had painted the village in shades of gold and rust, and the narrow track that led past Alys's cottage was lined with straw and fallen apples, beginning to rot sweetly in the cool air. It was in this season of change that her own life tilted toward a path she had long suspected, but never truly imagined. The chest by the hearth, her dowry chest, was nearly full. Each week, her mother had placed something inside: a folded shift of coarse linen, a woolen girdle dyed with onion skins into a muted yellow, a small wooden bowl carved by her father's own hands. These were humble things, but to Alys they seemed almost enchanted. Each item spoke of separation. They were not hers for now, but for the life that lay beyond her father's roof. When she brushed her fingertips across the cloth, she felt both anticipation and dread. A father's decision. One evening, after the fire had been fed with logs of oak and the light flickered warmly across the cottage's walls, her father cleared his throat. "Alys," he said, in a tone that was both gentle and firm, "the time has come to speak plainly. Thomas, the thatcher, has asked again." Her heart tightened. She had seen Thomas often, shoulders broad, hands roughened by years of work with reed and straw. He was no cruel man, yet there was an undeniable gap between them. He was nearer her father's age than her own. Her mother frowned, her hands busy with spinning. "She is still young, Richard. I would not see her given to a man already weathered by life. Let her wait a little longer." But Richard shook his head slowly. "We must think of her future. Thomas has work that endures. His thatching keeps the rain off half the village roofs. He can provide. Our daughter will not starve." This was the way of their world. In 12th century England, most marriages were not born of affection, but of survival and alliance. The church urged consent, but parental influence weighed heavily. Alys felt herself caught between obedience and the silent pull of her own wishes, which she barely dared to name. The betrothal. When an agreement was reached, preparations began for the betrothal, the solemn promise made before marriage itself. It was more than a whisper in the dark. It was a binding contract, often witnessed by kin or neighbors, and enforceable by the church courts if either party broke faith. On the morning of the small gathering, Alys was dressed in her best: a freshly laundered shift, a woolen kirtle in muted green, and her hair brushed until it shone like dark flax. The air smelled of damp rushes and hearth smoke. She could hear hens scratching in the yard and the distant lowing of cattle. Inside the cottage, Thomas arrived with his brother as witness. He spoke the words clearly, promising to wed her with God as witness. Her father clasped his hand, sealing the agreement. It was said that once a promise of marriage was exchanged in the present tense: "I take you as my wife." The church would already regard the couple as married in spirit. Betrothals were serious, and if later disputes arose, the courts of Canterbury or York could be called upon to enforce them. For Alys, the moment was heavy with stillness. The flicker of the rushlight made shadows tremble on the plastered walls. She lowered her eyes, feeling her cheeks warm. A part of her wanted to run into the cold night, to breathe the autumn air, and be only a girl again. Yet she also felt the gravity of belonging, of stepping into the circle of women whose lives were marked by the same path: blood, betrothal, childbirth. Her mother pressed a hand gently on her shoulder, steadying her. The fabric of her sleeve was rough wool, scratchy, yet reassuring. "You are not alone, my child," she whispered. The words lingered like the soft glow of firelight in her mind, carrying her into this next chapter of life. The autumn deepened into winter, and with it came long nights, the air heavy with the smell of smoke and damp wool. Alys often sat by the fire, listening to her father's low voice as he spoke with neighbors about quarrels, debts, and promises. The world of men's dealings sometimes seemed distant, yet more and more she found herself bound to it. The power of a promise her betrothal to Thomas was now known to the village. Still, she could not silence the whisper of unease within her. Was this truly her choice? Or had it been woven for her, like a thread in the great loom of kin and custom? Her mother, sensing her restlessness, told her in a hushed voice of cases that had reached even their distant corner of England. Cases where young women or men had broken promises of marriage, and the matter had been carried before the church courts. In one tale, a girl named Agnes had pledged herself to a young man by speaking the words, "I take you as my husband." Later, her parents sought a wealthier match, but the first words had bound her, and when she tried to break the promise, the young man brought her before the court. There, priests weighed testimony, asking, had the vows been said in earnest, in the present tense, and before witnesses? If so, the church declared the union indissoluble, even if no priest had blessed it at an altar. The telling of it made Alys shiver. A promise, once spoken, could not be unspoken. Disputes over dowries. Her father's voice grew harsher whenever the subject of her dowry arose. Though modest, it was no small thing. The chest filled with cloth, a few coins, and a measure of land he had long tended but promised to transfer to her husband's care. These were not only gifts, but legal securities, the guarantee that Alys would not enter marriage empty-handed. Yet such promises, too, could be contested. Her mother told her of another case, heard years ago in the bishop's court, a father who failed to deliver the dowry he had pledged. The groom's family pressed the matter, insisting the marriage contract had been betrayed. The court judged the father's honor at stake, demanding repayment or compensation. For Alys, the thought was strange. Her life, her very body, seemed tangled with cloth and coin, as though she were both daughter and currency. And yet, this was the law of their time. A woman's worth measured, not diminished, but translated into gifts and goods, her presence the binding thread between families. Consent and the church, though parents and fathers made choices, the church spoke often of consent. Priests reminded villagers that marriage was not valid without the willing words of bride and groom. But in practice, how free was that consent when a father's hand pressed at one's back? Alys thought of the priest's stern face at Sunday Mass, his Latin words floating above the bowed heads of the congregation. Voluntas, will. Yet whose will truly counted? Sometimes she imagined what it would be like to stand in such a court, her voice trembling as she declared yes or no. Would they listen to her? Would they hear her heart's murmur beneath the weight of her father's decision? The crackle of the fire filled the silence, sparks leaping like tiny stars. She closed her eyes and let the warmth wash over her. For now, she remained betrothed, the contract unbroken. But the stories of others haunted her, their disputes, their lost dowries, their forced unions, sealed by words spoken, perhaps too quickly. Somewhere deep inside, she wondered if her own story, too, might one day be recited in the court records, her name preserved not as daughter or wife, but as a case, an argument, a voice among many in the halls of the church. The air was sharp with frost. Alys rose before dawn, her breath curling pale in the dimness, and listened to the house still asleep. Soon, her own wedding day would come, but in her mind stirred the voices of others, women whose lives, though distant, had left shadows in the records of the church courts. The case of Alys, of Angers her mother, once whispered of a story from France, passed down by a wandering cleric, a girl named Alys of Angers, in the late 12th century. She had been betrothed by her family to a prosperous man, but she herself had spoken vows of love to another. When the matter came before the bishop's court, both men claimed her hand. The clerics questioned her words carefully. Had she said, "I will take you," a promise for the future, or "I take you," a binding vow of the present? The difference between future tense and present tense could decide a life. In the end, the court judged her first words binding. She belonged to the poorer man she had chosen, even against her parents' will. The story comforted Alys, though it also unsettled her. Could words spoken in a meadow, or whispered in secret, outweigh her father's arrangements? The dowry of Emma, daughter of Robert Another Tale, came from England, in the diocese of Ely. A woman named Emma had been promised with a dowry of land, 2 strips in the village fields. But when her father failed to deliver, her husband's family brought the matter before the bishop. The record said the court required sworn oaths from neighbors who had witnessed the betrothal contract. Some testified they remembered the father's promise. Others swore they did not. The court split the land, awarding part to the husband, part kept by the bride's kin. For Alys, the details stung. Land itself seemed as much a bride as the woman. Her chest of linen and silver coins now felt heavy, not with value, but with burden. The dispute of Marjorie and William Hare Priest once mentioned a case from York, around 1220. A young woman named Marjorie claimed she had been forced to marry William by her parents. In the court, she insisted, trembling, that she had never consented. Witnesses were called. Some said she had spoken the vows clearly, others that her voice had been silenced by her father's stern command. The court judged that her amen at the end of the ritual had bound her, even if fear had filled her heart. Alys felt the echo in her bones. How thin the line was between willing and unwilling, between a girl's soft voice and the law's sharp pen. The weight of history on Alys these stories reached her, like fragments of distant songs. She wondered if the scribes, dipping quills into ink, had thought of the women themselves, whether they imagined faces, eyes lowered, hands folded in rough cloth. Or were the women reduced to names and clauses, stripped of flesh, bound to parchment? And still, the courts spoke always of consent. It was the Church's great claim that marriage rested on the free will of bride and groom. Yet the same courts, with equal certainty, upheld contracts made in fear, promises shaped by fathers, dowries left unpaid, or broken pledges stitched back together in judgment halls. Alys at the threshold. On quiet nights, when the frost silvered the thatch, Alys lay awake, her mind wandering through these cases. She tried to imagine her own name inscribed there, Alys, daughter of John of Lincolnshire. Would the records say she had agreed freely, or that her silence had been taken as assent? Would it list her dowry as cloth and land, or measure her worth in the soft weight of her body, her womb, her obedience? And yet, the candles still burned at the altar, the bells still tolled, and her wedding day drew nearer. The echo of other voices surrounded her, women from England, from France, from the parchment of forgotten courts. She carried them with her, like invisible sisters, their fates whispering against her skin as she stepped closer to her own. The morning came pale and cold, a thin frost veiling the thatch and hedgerows, turning each leaf to crystal. Alys woke to the hush of the house, to the muffled stirrings of her mother by the hearth. Smoke curled from the fire, carrying the scent of damp wood and rosemary her mother had thrown on the embers, for cleansing, for luck. The linen shift she wore clung cool against her skin. Over it, her mother laced her wedding gown, wool the color of deep russet, edged with a band of embroidery her grandmother's hands had made. Around her waist lay a girdle, knotted in front, the knot heavy with meaning. The church spoke often of knots, the knot of marriage, the tying of two into one. Her veil was fine linen, not lace as noblewomen wore, but white enough to shimmer in the dim light. Her mother smoothed it over her hair with trembling hands, then kissed her forehead, whispering, "Deus te custodiat. God keep you." The procession to the church outside, neighbors gathered, stamping feet in the frost, waiting for the procession. Bells rang from the small stone church at the edge of the village. Children carried sprigs of holly and ivy, their laughter thin in the cold air. Alys's father took her hand, firm and heavy. Behind them walked the witnesses, her uncle, the reeve of the village, and two cousins of the groom. They were needed not only to celebrate, but to testify, if ever the union were disputed in the courts. The path to the church crunched beneath their boots, the fields on either side hard with winter. Yet voices rose with cheer, snatches of songs, the rough harmony of men's laughter, the brighter notes of women calling blessings. At the church door, the ceremony began not inside, but at the church door. This was the custom. Vows spoken in the open, under God's sky, before all eyes. Only after consent would the bride and groom step within, to the altar. Alys stood beside her groom, Thomas, a man of steady bearing, son of a craftsman. His cloak was lined with fur at the collar, his hands red from work and cold. He looked at her with a nervous half-smile, and for a heartbeat, she felt the thrum of her own blood louder than the bells. The priest asked the question, "Do you, Alys, take Thomas?" Her lips trembled. She remembered the tales of Marjorie and Emma, of Alys of Anger. She remembered how words could bind, how silence could be taken as consent. She drew breath, the air cold in her throat, and whispered, "I do." The joining of hands. The priest took their right hands and placed them together, wrapping them with the stole of his vestment. The fabric was rough wool, faint with incense and candle smoke. He murmured the Latin words, blessing the union. Alys felt Thomas's hand, warm, strong, slightly calloused, pressing hers. For a moment, she thought of it as a tether, a binding cord. But she also felt steadiness in it, a pulse beneath the skin, a human weight against her own. The ring and the blessing, a simple bronze ring, hammered by the village smith, was placed upon her finger. The priest traced the sign of the cross over it, intoning blessings. It slid cold over her knuckle, then warmed quickly with the heat of her hand. The congregation murmured, some crossing themselves, others whispering their own prayers. Above them, the bells pealed, echoing across the fields, carrying the news of union to the sky. Entering the church only then did they cross the threshold. The dim interior smelled of beeswax, old wood, and stone chilled by winter. Candles flickered, their flames bending with each draft of the door. At the altar, the priest blessed them again, asking for fruitfulness, for fidelity, for God's grace upon their household. Alys bowed her head, the veil falling forward like a curtain. Beneath it, her breath was soft, her thoughts restless. She was wife now, bound by vow and witness, by court and church, by God and man alike. And yet, as she knelt, she thought of the frost outside, of the fields waiting for spring, of the cycle of life turning onward. Something in her heart stirred with the rhythm of all women before her, those whose names were written in parchment, those whose stories were never told. And now, herself. The bells had scarcely fallen silent before the feast began. In the manor hall of the local lord, borrowed for the occasion, for no cottage could hold so many, torches hissed and spat resin, filling the air with warmth and smoke. The walls, rough with wattle and plaster, gleamed in the firelight. Alys sat beside Thomas at the high board. Before them lay trenchers of bread, thick with roasted goose and onions, steaming pottage, and wheels of coarse cheese. Honey cakes dusted with spice, a luxury brought from far lands, were shared in thin slices. Ale flowed from wooden jugs, frothing amber, the scent yeasty and sweet. The music began. A rebec, its string sharp and bright, joined by a pipe that whistled like wind over stone. Children clapped. Men stamped their feet on the floorboards, shaking the benches. Laughter rolled through the hall, heavy with smoke and cheer. The communal joy neighbors came forward with gifts: a hen tied with twine, a small sack of barley, a woolen blanket spun by a cousin's hands. Each offering, however humble, was a thread in the fabric of the marriage, a sign that Alys and Thomas did not walk into union alone. They were woven into the village itself. The reeve lifted his cup and declared the marriage blessed. Then the priest spoke once more, reminding all that what was done at the church door was now sealed not only by word, but by bread, salt, and witness. The bedding ritual, as the night deepened, the custom of the bedding began. Torches were carried to the small chamber where the couple would sleep. Women led Alys, her veil loosened, her gown unlaced just enough to show she was no longer maiden, but wife. Men led Thomas, laughing, slapping his back, pressing mugs of ale into his hands. The bed was simple: straw mattress, woolen sheets, a coverlet woven in red and black. Neighbors crowded the door, some tossing handfuls of oats for fertility, others singing rough verses, both bawdy and merry. Then, one by one, they withdrew, leaving only the quiet flicker of the fire and the soft breathing of two who had been strangers not long ago. The stillness of night. The room smelled of rushes and wood smoke. Alys lay with her head upon the coarse pillow, listening to Thomas's breathing steady beside her. Her own pulse was quick, like the wings of a sparrow. She thought of all that had led here, the lessons of her mother, the whispers of girls by the well, the weight of church law, the ink of court records, the ancient customs stretching back beyond memory. She was now a part of that long chain. Outside, the frost deepened, silvering the village roofs. Within, the fire settled to embers. The world grew hushed, as if holding its breath. Alys closed her eyes. The wool blanket was rough, but warm against her skin. She heard the faint crackle of a log, the sigh of the wind in the thatch, the slow, steady rhythm of her husband's chest rising and falling. And in that moment, in the mingling of silence and warmth, she felt not fear nor triumph, but a kind of peace. Life had turned a page, as surely as the seasons, as surely as the bells had rung, as surely as frost would melt into spring. The story was no longer hers alone. It was shared between man and woman, between family and village, between earth and heaven. And so, with the stillness of the medieval night pressing soft upon her, Alys drifted into sleep.